Hello viewers, welcome to another session of the pathology discussions, pathology lectures. So today the topic of my discussion will be about necrosis, its type and examples. So just a brief definition as to what is actually necrosis. So necrosis is actually a form of a cell death which occurs in a pathological or a diseased organs. It is whenever there occurs an irreversible cellular injury, so the process of necrosis occurs and it is a passive cell death process. So here there is no gene expression is required, no protein synthesis is required. It is a passive form of cell death which occurs whenever the cell is exposed to an irreversible cellular injury occurs. The cell death, what occurs, it is the necrosis. So today I'll be focusing upon the types of necrosis. So there are basically the 5 types of necrosis what can be seen. So the first type, the 5 types can be looked upon as, first is the coagulative necrosis, the next is the liquefactive necrosis, the third is the caseous necrosis, fourth being the fat necrosis, and 5 is the fibrinoid necrosis. So today I'll be talking about the distinguishing and the striking features of each of such necrosis. Each of the types of necrosis, the distinguishing and the striking features I'll be discussing today. So moving on to the first type of necrosis, that is the coagulative necrosis. So students out there, the coagulative necrosis, it is very important MCQ that as amongst all the 5 necrosis, which is the most common type of necrosis. So the coagulative necrosis, it is the most common type of necrosis which occurs in mostly all of the solid organs, exception being the brain. So there are, whatever all the solid organs of the body are there, the necrosis that is occurring, it is the coagulative necrosis, except the brain, which shows liquefactive necrosis. So on looking at the cellular, when talking of at the cellular changes, what are going to occur in the coagulative necrosis, we find that the cell outlines are maintained in case of coagulative necrosis. That is, the cellular architecture is maintained and there occurs changes only at the nuclear level. So cellular architecture is maintained in the case of coagulative necrosis and there occurs only changes at the nuclear level. So, and this is okay, this is the feature of it. But if there occurs some kind of a alteration in the cellular architecture, so that can be also marked as the conversion of the normal cells into their tombstones. If the normal cells are going to transform into tombstone-like appearance, so this can be the hallmark of coagulative necrosis. So most commonly occurs, the most common cause of coagulative necrosis is ischemia. So whenever, what is ischemia actually, students? So ischemia is basically whenever there is a decreased blood supply to a particular organ, ischemia occurs. So coagulative necrosis is mostly seen in the end organs. So the common type of examples includes the infarcts of the heart, kidney, liver and spleen are the most common, the very famous examples for coagulative necrosis. Now it can be, this all can be summarized that the coagulative necrosis, it can be considered it is a type of a dry gangrene. Now moving on to the second example, the second type of necrosis is the liquefactive necrosis. So the liquefactive necrosis is a type of another name by which it is known as the coagulative necrosis. So the liquefactive necrosis is also called as the coagulative necrosis, and here in comparison, on comparing with the coagulative necrosis, here in case of liquefactive necrosis, the cellular architecture is lost. Alright, so cellular architecture is lost. There occurs enzymatic digestion of the tissues. Necrotic tissue is soft and liquefied. So as compared to the coagulative necrosis, in coagulative necrosis, the cellular architecture was maintained. But here, in case of liquefactive necrosis, mostly there occurs the cellular architecture is lost. So there only nuclear changes were evident, but here the cellular architecture itself is lost in as accompanied by the changes in the nucleus also. So here in liquefactive necrosis, there occurs the enzymatic digestion of the tissue. Necrotic tissue is soft and liquefied, and the very famous example of liquefactive coagulative necrosis, it is mostly found in brain, that is in the CNS. That is the central nervous system, particularly the brain, shows the what type of, if necrosis occurs in brain, it is the liquefactive necrosis which occurs in brain cells. So cell outlines are not maintained in case of liquefactive necrosis, and the liquefactive necrosis is also seen in areas of bacterial infection. So wherever there are areas which show bacterial infection, liquefactive necrosis can be seen. So the very common examples of this liquefactive necrosis can be in the form of, it can be seen in the infarcts of brain, it can be seen in the abscess cavity, because abscess cavity is obviously the abscess cavity is containing a large number of bacteria. So that is infection, bacterial infection is occurring. So it can be seen in the abscess cavity, and the liquefactive necrosis can be considered as a type of wet gangrene. Now moving on to another third type, that is the caseous necrosis. So actually the word caseous refers to a certain cheese-like appearance. So caseous word, it is referring to the cottage cheese-like appearance, and this type of caseous necrosis is basically combining the features of both the coagulative necrosis as well as the liquefactive necrosis. So the caseous necrosis combines the features of both the coagulative and the liquefactive necrosis. The architecture is not preserved, but the tissue is not liquefied. Now, in contrast with the liquefactive necrosis, what we find, there also the architecture is lost, but the tissue, in case of liquefactive necrosis, it gets liquefied. Whereas in case of caseous necrosis, although there is a cellular architecture, this cellular architecture is not preserved, but the cells, they do not get liquefied. The cells are not liquefied. So what the basic striking feature, what is seen, that is in caseous necrosis, it is mostly found in tubercular granulomas. It is mostly seen in the cases of TB. Tuberculosis is a very famous example for the caseous necrosis. And what is actually the chemical compound? It is the caseous necrosis is occurring due to the presence of a lipopolysaccharide present in the capsule of the Mycobacterium. So Mycobacterium tuberculosis is the causative organism for tuberculosis. Since tuberculosis is seen, the caseous necrosis is basically seen in the patients of tuberculosis. In different types of tuberculosis, the caseous necrosis is seen. So actually what is occurring at the cellular level, that in the capsule of the Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which is the causative organism for tuberculosis, there is presence of a lipopolysaccharide, which is responsible for the caseating phenomena, which is responsible for the caseous necrosis, that is, which is going to give it a cottage cheese appearance. So the very famous examples include the tubercular granulomas of lungs, the fungal infections, and the gummas. So these three are the very widely known examples for caseous necrosis. Moving on to the next category, that is the fat necrosis. So fat necrosis is basically seen in three organs, that is the pancreas, the breast, and the omentum. So what the special feature is that it is a special fat necrosis. It is a special type of necrosis which is going to occur at two anatomically different locations, but they are occurring in morphologically similar lesions. So the examples, very famous examples include the acute pancreatic necrosis due to autodigestion of parenchyma of the pancreatic by the pancreatic enzymes. So acute pancreatic necrosis. So acute pancreatic necrosis usually occurs whenever there occurs the autodigestion of the parenchyma of the pancreas by the pancreatic enzymes. So mostly the fat necrosis is autoimmune. So the next example is the necrosis of the breast. So necrosis of the breast due to trauma to the cells is another example of fat necrosis. So because the breast tissue is made up of fat, so fat necrosis is most commonly found in the breast. Finally, the last subtype, the last type of necrosis, that is the fibrinoid necrosis. The fibrinoid necrosis is mostly seen in the type 2 and the type 3 hypersensitivity reaction whenever there is a deposition of fibrin in the vessel wall. So whenever there is going to be a deposition of fibrin in the vessel wall, the fibrinoid necrosis occurs. And the very common, the very famous examples includes the Ascoff's nodules seen in rheumatic heart disease, the polyarteritis nodosa, the vasculitis what occurs in polyarteritis nodosa, and in malignant hypertension. So malignant hypertension, it also shows malignant hypertension, there occurs fibrinoid necrosis. So students out there, this was all the 5 types of necrosis, the distinguishing features of each and every type, and how we can very easily remember them just by a brief comparison between all of them. I have compared all the types of necrosis here. So students out there, if you do like my video, don't forget to subscribe my channel and do press the bell icon so that you can be further updated about the newer videos. Thank you for watching.